Hey everyone, and welcome to a tour of my very first commander deck, Zedruu the Greathearted. The original version of this deck was the pre-constructed deck Political Puppets back in Commander 2011, and it was my first introduction to the format. Me and a few of my buddies wanted to get into Commander, so each of us bought one of the pre-constructed decks back in 2011, and I settled on Political Puppets. Zedruu is a Jeskai legendary creature, a 4-mana 2/4 with 2 abilities. The first is a triggered ability. At the beginning of your upkeep, you gain X life and draw X cards, where X is the number of permanents you own that your opponents control. So for example, if your opponents control 2 permanents that you own, you will gain 2 life and draw 2 cards on your upkeep. She also has an activated ability. For red, white, and blue, target opponent gains control of target permanent you control. So essentially, you're going to be using her activated ability to give your permanents away to your opponents, and then gain life and draw cards on your upkeep with her triggered ability. Now, Zedruu isn't the strongest commander or the scariest commander these days, and honestly, even back in 2011, she wasn't particularly strong compared to some of the face commanders of the other pre-constructed decks. But I immediately fell in love with her as soon as I saw her, and it was largely because there was one card I really wanted to pair with her. This is the card that made me want to pick up Political Puppets. Illusions of Grandeur is a 4-mana enchantment that says when it enters the battlefield, you gain 20 life, and when it leaves the battlefield, you lose 20 life. And it has a cumulative upkeep cost of 2, which means at the beginning of your upkeep, you put an age counter on this enchantment, then you have to pay 2 mana for each age counter on it. And if you don't pay the mana cost, you sacrifice Illusions of Grandeur, and when you sacrifice Illusions of Grandeur, it leaves the battlefield and you lose 20 life. Now, I was first introduced to this card as a little kid when I was wasting time reading magazines in chapters, and there was this old Magic the Gathering magazine in there that I know doesn't exist anymore, that was literally half of it was Magic the Gathering and half of it was Pokemon, and it was literally split in the middle between these two halves. I'm not sure what magazine it was. It might have been Inquest, it might have been The Duelist, it might have been Dojo, I really don't remember. But in one of those magazines, I remember reading about this old constructed deck called Tricks, and it was built around this enchantment. The idea was to cast Illusions of Grandeur, gaining 20 life, and then give your opponent control of Illusions of Grandeur with a spell called Donate. Then, when your opponent could no longer pay the cumulative upkeep cost, or if you destroyed the enchantment yourself or bounced it or whatever, they would lose 20 life and they would lose the game. So as a little kid, I thought the concept of Tricks was the coolest deck ever, and while I never got to play it myself, I always remembered how cool that concept was. So fast forward years later, and when I saw Zedruu the Greathearted, and I noticed that her activated ability is literally what Donate does, I knew I had to pick up this deck and add Illusions of Grandeur into it. So that was the first card I added to the precon. Now, I've been playing with this deck for a decade now, and over the years, I've been making a lot of different changes to it, reworks, overhauls, but I keep coming back to my favorite archetype, which is essentially Mean Zedruu, and it's exemplified by Illusions of Grandeur. The idea being that I have a bunch of permanents that are really bad if you control it, and I donate it to my opponents so that they suffer the consequences. And there's a few other permanents that are also particularly nasty in this deck. Statecraft is a 4-mana enchantment that says prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to and dealt by creatures you control. So our deck has a lot of very small creatures, and they can't really do much more than chump block, and they usually die while blocking. With Statecraft on the battlefield, our 1/1s, our 2/2s, or whatever, suddenly can block things that are much bigger than them and not die in the process, so we can use it defensively in that regard. But giving it to an opponent who is focused on combat damage, someone like a Xenagos God of Revels, for example, a Stompy style deck, basically means that they can't attack anybody. Their creatures no longer deal damage. So we can just gift it to whoever is the most aggressive creature-wise at the table, or we could just use it as a bargaining chip. We can say to that person, hey, if you want to keep attacking people, you better not attack me, or else I'm going to donate Statecraft to you with Zedruu, and your creatures aren't going to be doing any more damage, which I think is hilarious and is an incredibly powerful political tool when used properly. Here's a weird artifact hate for you. This is Rust Elemental, a 4-mana 4/4 artifact elemental creature or flying that has, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice an artifact other than Rust Elemental. If you can't, tap Rust Elemental and you lose 4 life. So we use Zedruu to hand this Rust Elemental over to somebody who has artifacts, and every single turn they're going to have to sacrifice one of their other artifacts to appease the Rust Elemental. And if they don't have any artifacts, they're going to lose 4 life every single turn. Essentially a goofy way to destroy artifacts. Next up, we have some creature hate with Steel Golem. This is a 3-mana 3/4 artifact creature whose Oracle text says you can't cast creature spells. So again, the idea here is to donate this to somebody who is very creature focused, and suddenly they will not be able to cast any creature spells until they get rid of the Steel Golem. There are a lot of popular commanders out there that are very creature focused, and giving them this Steel Golem will suddenly ruin their plans. I've given Steel Golem to Animar players in the past, and literally their decks are almost entirely creatures, and even their removal for artifacts or creatures are creature based, so they literally did not have a single answer to Steel Golem, and eventually they would only get to play the game again once the board was wiped, which is, I think, hilarious. But perhaps the meanest card in this entire deck to give to somebody is Pyromancer's Swath. This is a 3-mana red enchantment that says if an instant or sorcery you control would deal damage to a creature or player, it deals that much damage +2 to that creature or player instead. And at the beginning of each end step, discard your hand. So we just donate Pyromancer's Swath to somebody who has a bunch of cards in their hand, and then at the beginning of each end step, they discard their hand. Now keep in mind, this is each end step, not the beginning of their end step. So they won't even get a chance to cast sorcery speed spells like creatures or enchantments or sorceries before they have to discard their entire hand. So this card is incredibly brutal and might get a little bit of salt, but honestly, this card is just so good in Zedruu that I'm willing to troll a little bit for it, you know? Maybe that's the Crim influence in me talking, but this card is absolutely hilarious. Next, we have a bunch of cards that essentially exchange themselves for a permanent that our opponents control. And these cards are super beneficial in Zedruu because that means we don't have to pay 3 mana with Zedruu to gift them to somebody else. They just automatically gift themselves, and then we get to draw cards and gain life off Zedruu more mana efficiently. So the first and most powerful of the bunch has to be Gilded Drake. This is a 2-mana 3/3 flyer that says when Gilded Drake enters the battlefield, exchange control of Gilded Drake for target creature one of your opponent's controls, or sacrifice Gilded Drake. So for 2 mana, we get to steal our opponent's best creature, sometimes their commander, sometimes just a threatening creature, and they just get a 3/3 flying Drake instead. And we get to gain 1 life and draw 1 card off that Drake. Now this was one of the first cards that I picked up to upgrade Zedruu, and I remember at the time I spent $10 Canadian buying a copy of this, and at the time I thought that was a ridiculous amount of money to spend on a single piece of cardboard. But for people who are aware of this card, it's pretty good in older formats and it's good in CEDH. It is on the reserve list, so it went up in price just a little bit from the $10 Canadian that I spent. So in hindsight, looking back, I will say that I'm less annoyed with how much money I spent on it 10 years ago. This is a card that was in the precon originally that I still love to this day, Vidalkin Plotter. This is a 3-mana 1/1 creature Vidalkin wizard that says when it enters the battlefield, exchange control of target land you control and target land an opponent controls. So essentially we get to exchange our worst land for our opponent's best land. And the nice thing about this exchange is that lands don't often get messed with, so we basically guarantee that we're going to be gaining 1 life and drawing 1 card off the land we exchanged with our opponent with Zedruu for the remainder of the game. And since Vidalkin Plotter is a creature as well, we can also donate and exchange it with Zedruu or other spells in our deck. Next we have a way to exchange spells with Perplexing Chimera. This is a 5-mana 3/3 enchantment creature chimera that says whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may exchange control of Perplexing Chimera and that spell. If you do, you may choose new targets for the spell. So, for example, if somebody is aiming a targeted removal spell at one of our permanents, we can exchange control of that removal spell with the Chimera and then redirect that removal spell to something else. Or if our opponents cast anything that is particularly tasty, a really high value spell, we just exchange it with the Chimera, we get control of that spell, we get the value out of that spell, and now our opponents are controlling a Chimera that we're going to be drawing cards and gaining life off of with Zedruu. Next up, we have another powerful way to exchange control of permanents with Ineaz the Gale Force. This is a 5-mana 4/4 legendary creature Djinn with flying that has 2 abilities. The activated ability costs 2 and either white or blue. Attacking creatures with flying get +1/+1 until end of turn. And she has a triggered ability that says whenever 3 or more creatures you control with flying attack, each player gains control of a non-land permanent of your choice controlled by the player to their right. Now this triggered ability is so powerful that I made sure to add additional flying creatures just so I can more reliably trigger it. Because even ignoring the fact that exchanging control of our permanents for our opponent's permanents will mean we're going to be drawing cards off Zedruu, just exchanging control of an opponent's commander for some other creature another opponent controls or something that we control can kind of ruin opponents' decks. A lot of decks are focused on their commanders, so having them lose control of their commander can really cripple their deck, and they won't be able to function as well until they have a way of removing the commander or returning it back to their battlefield somehow. So this card is really powerful and really fun. So a big theme of our deck is exchanging our permanents for our opponent's best ones, and one of the best cards for that is Cultural Exchange. This is a blue sorcery that costs 6 mana, and it says choose any number of creatures target player controls, then choose the same number of creatures another target player controls. Those players exchange control of those creatures. Now this deck has a lot of token producers and creatures with powerful enter the battlefield effects, but don't have any good passive abilities once they actually remain on the battlefield. So what we do with those creatures is we cast something like Cultural Exchange, and we exchange our weak creatures for our opponent's best ones. It could be their commanders, it could be whatever big threats they have on the battlefield, and this is a way to do that on a massive scale. So if we have like 6 tokens or whatever, we can exchange all 6 of those for our opponent's best 6 creatures. And then we have another really great engine to exchange control of permanents. This is Puka's Mischief. This is a 4-mana blue enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, you may exchange control of target non-land permanent you control and target non-land permanent an opponent controls with an equal or lesser converted mana cost. So again, we have a lot of permanents that we don't really care about after they enter the battlefield, and our opponents probably have some really tasty ones, so we can exchange control of our weak permanents for their best ones. So not only is that a big win for us, but we're also going to be gaining life and drawing cards off Zedruu in the process, so it's like a double win for us. Next we have another powerful exchange effect, Role Reversal. This is an Izzet sorcery spell for 3 mana, exchange control of 2 target permanents that share a permanent type. So this one isn't restricted by converted mana cost or anything. We can just pick a 1/1 soldier token that we have on the battlefield, and we can just grab our opponent's Avenger of Zendikar or whatever big powerful creature they have just sitting around. It's a massive tempo swing for us, and we gain life and draw cards off Zedruu, of course. Next we have Sudden Substitution. This is a 4-mana blue instant with Split Second, which means nobody can cast anything or activate anything in response while it's on the stack. And it says exchange control of target non-creature spell and target creature. Then the spell's controller may choose new targets for it. So when an opponent casts a juicy non-creature spell, we can gain control of it with Sudden Substitution, and in exchange, our opponents get some crummy creature that we don't want anyway, and we just start drawing cards and gaining life off Zedruu. Then we have another exchange spell, Ledgerman, a 4-mana blue sorcery that says permanently exchange control of target artifact or creature for control of target permanent of the same type. So again, we take our weakest artifact or creature and we grab our opponent's greatest artifact or creature instead. Now, not all of the cards we gift away with Zedruu are mean cards or steal stuff from our opponent. We have some stuff that is kind of nice to get. And one of them is my favorite land in the entire deck, Rainbow Veil. So you tap it for mana and then you pass it to target opponent that you choose. You can often use this land politically to gain favor to one target opponent, and then you give that Rainbow Veil to that opponent. So you kind of help ramp them, maybe not attack you or blow up something of yours. But either way, as long as you're not controlling it, Zedruu is going to gain you life and draw you cards. Next we have a Crow and Horse. This is a 4-mana artifact creature, a 0/4 with Defender, and it says when it enters the battlefield, an opponent gains control of it. At the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent puts a 1/1 white soldier creature token onto the battlefield. So you cast a Crow and Horse, you pass it to an opponent, and then on their upkeep, everyone else gets a 1/1 soldier token. So this is a nice, efficient way to start drawing cards and gaining life of Zedruu. And it also produces tokens for you, which you can then also donate with Zedruu or exchange other ways. Next we have a friendly card draw spell with Humble Defector. This is a red 2-mana 2/1 that can tap to draw 2 cards, then target opponent gains control of Humble Defector, and you can only activate it during your turn. So very simple, we tap it, draw 2 cards, then give it to an opponent, and then get to draw even more cards with Zedruu. Here's another group hug card that I like in this deck, Pendant of Prosperity. This is a 3-mana artifact that enters the battlefield under the control of an opponent of your choice. And the controller can pay to and tap it to draw a card, then put a land card from their hand onto the battlefield. And the owner of Pendant of Prosperity, us, draws a card, then puts a land card from their hand onto the battlefield. So you help out an opponent, but you're also helping out yourself as well. And since you don't control the pendant, Zedruu's drawing your cards as well. So I just covered a bunch of ways that we can donate or exchange our permanents for value. But there's also a bunch of ways that we can return those permanents back on our side of the battlefield. One of the best ways is the Planeswalker Venser the Sojourner. This is an Azorius Planeswalker that costs 5 mana, 3 starting loyalty, and it has a +2 ability that says exile target permanent you own. Return it to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. So any permanent we give away might not be under our control, but we still own it. And then Venser can exile it and it will re-enter the battlefield under our control again. A lot of our permanents have powerful enter the battlefield effects, so Venser is really good, doubling the value out of all those, and obviously it's really good with Illusions of Grandeur because we can make that opponent lose 20 life when it leaves the battlefield, then we gain 20 life again when it re-enters the battlefield under our control, and then we could donate to a new target and do this over and over again and just drain people for 20 repeatedly. It's hilarious. I love it. Next we have Brand. This is a 1 red mana instant that just says gain control of all permanents you own. So everything we gave away, we can suddenly return back to our side of the battlefield at instant speed for a single mana. This card has won me tons of games as I just suddenly grab all the permanents that I gave away earlier for a single red mana. Next we have Homeward Path. This is a indispensable land, one of the best lands in the entire deck. It can tap for 1 colorless, but we can also activate it to have each player gain control of all creatures they own. So if we want any of our creatures back, we can just grab them back. If we exchange control of our creatures for non-creature spells, that's even better because we'll get back our creatures, but our opponents will not get back their non-creature cards. And the last way we can sneakily get back all the permanents we gave away is Leave to Chance. The first side of the card, Leave, is a white instant for 2 mana. Return any number of target permanents you own to your hand. So again, anything we gave away to our opponents, just for 2 mana, we can return it back to our hand. But also, if anybody's trying to wipe our board or kill Zedruu or do anything of the sort, we can protect our own board state by casting Leave and just bouncing everything to our hand instead of letting them get destroyed. The Aftermath side, Chance, lets us just basically cycle away cards that we don't need for cards we do need. So it's still quite useful, even though the primary use of this card is the leave side, not the chance side, though having chance is very nice as well. Next, we have a bunch of removal spells. This deck is very much a control deck, so I have a lot of answers to a lot of our opponent's shenanigans, and you'll also notice that a lot of them are permanents, and I made sure to focus heavily on permanents because you can then exchange control of those permanents with those swap spells, or you could just donate them with Zedruu, whichever works. So an answer to artifacts I've chosen is Thieving Skydiver. This is a 2-mana 2/1 Merfolk Rogue with flying that has kicker X, and when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you gain control of target artifact with converted mana cost X or less, and if that artifact is an equipment, you attach it to Thieving Skydiver. Generally speaking, this is basically pay 3 mana, steal an opponent's Sol Ring, have a 2/1 flyer on the battlefield as well, and then afterwards, just donate it or exchange it or bounce it or whatever to get even more value out of it. Then we got Grasp of Fate. This is a 3-mana white enchantment that says when it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, exile up to 1 target non-land permanent that player controls until Grasp of Fate leaves the battlefield. So think Oblivion Ring, but it hits every single opponent, which is fantastic in multiplayer. And of course, it doesn't matter who controls Grasp of Fate once it's done its job, so we just donate it or exchange it or whatever. Then we have one of my favorite underrated removal spells. This is Dweger Hedge Mage. This is 2 and a red or a white for a 2/2 Dwarf Shaman that when it enters the battlefield, if you control 2 or more mountains, you may destroy target artifacts, and when it enters the battlefield, if you control 2 or more planes, you may destroy target enchantment. So generally speaking, when I'm casting this spell, since I have a lot of mountains and planes in the deck, I'm going to be blowing up an artifact and enchantment every single time, and then you have a 2/2 body that you could do with what you will. Next we have Skyclave Apparition. This is a white 3-mana 2/2 creature that when it enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target non-land non-token permanent you don't control with converted mana cost 4 or less. And when it leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner creates a XX blue illusion creature token where X is the converted mana cost of the exiled card. So they don't get the exiled card back, they just get an illusion token instead. It's very versatile. Even though it can't hit anything converted mana cost 5 or less, it hits plenty of powerful things, and the fact that your opponents will never get that thing back is the icing on the cake. Next we have a unconventional board wipe with Elspeth, Sun's Champion. Most of our creatures are very small, so Elspeth's -3 ability, destroy all creatures with power 4 or greater, is very useful in this deck, as it's a great way to wipe the board of our opponent's greater creatures without actually touching our own creatures. And she's always useful in this deck as well because of her +1 ability that puts 3 1/1 white soldier creature tokens onto the battlefield, and the tokens are very useful in this deck because we can exchange those creatures or just donate them for extra value. Then we have one of the greatest cards in Commander. It's Cyclonic Rift. Love it, hate it. It's one of the best board wipes in the entire game, and it's especially useful in the Zedruu deck because it's yet another way for us to return stuff that we've given away or exchanged and bounce it back to our hand to recast later on. Then we have an amazing answer to basically any problematic creature, Darksteel Mutation. It's a white 2-mana enchantment aura that enchants creature. Enchanted creature is a 0/1 insect artifact creature with indestructible and loses all other abilities. This card is absolutely devastating to put on an opposing commander because all of their abilities go away and they're just a weird insect creature with indestructible, so they're hard to remove. And as long as they're on the battlefield, they can't recast it from the command zone, and they have to find a way to either sacrifice or remove the creature somehow, or remove the aura before they can start using their commander again. And since we don't have that much graveyard recursion, we don't really care about our graveyard too much, we can run one of the nastiest graveyard hate pieces in the format, and that's Rest in Peace. It's a white 2-mana enchantment that says when it enters the battlefield, exile all cards from all graveyards, and if a creature or token will be put into a graveyard from anywhere, you exile it instead. This completely shuts down any graveyard heavy deck, and it also really hurts basically any deck that runs a decent amount of graveyard recursion, which is most decks. Not this one. So you just play it, you ruin everybody's graveyards, and then you just donate it away because who cares who actually controls it, you always get the value out of it anyway. Then we have a kind of bad counter magic, but it's a permanent, so I like it. It's Ashiok's Erasure. This is a blue 4-mana enchantment with flash that says when it enters the battlefield, exile target spell. Your opponents can't cast spells with the same name as the exile card, and when it leaves the battlefield, return the exile card to its owner's hand. So it's like a 4-mana temporary counterspell in Commander, but I like that it's a permanent, so you can actually donate it away and get extra value out of it. So it's thematic, that's why I like it. And the last piece of straight up removal in this deck is Ondu Inversion. Despite the memes, I actually like Ondu Inversion. I won't run it in all my decks, but I do think it is a pretty nice board wipe, and it's flexible because the backside of it can always be played as a tapped land. This deck is a control deck. It likes long games, so getting to 8 mana and wiping the board isn't something that is too difficult for this deck to do. And early on, you can just play it as a land. It doesn't matter. It's totally fine. So yeah, I like it. Next up, we have my favorite part of any deck, and it's the card draw. So like I said earlier, not all the cards in the deck are that mean. Some of them are kind of nice, and this is one of the group hug cards in the deck. This is Dictate of Crewfix. This is a 3-mana blue enchantment with flash that says at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. So it helps the table out. Everybody gets to draw a card, but we get to draw one extra card when we donate it and then get an extra card off Zedruu. And we have the original Dictate of Crewfix as well, Howling Mine, a 2-mana artifact that does the exact same thing at the beginning of each player's draw step. If Howling Mine is untapped, that player draws an additional card. So we play it, we donate it, we draw more cards than our opponents off it, but everybody's happy. Now, since the deck has a lot of token producers, some you've already seen, but some I will get to a little bit later, Skullclamp becomes really, really good in the deck. It doesn't really have any special synergy with Zedruu, but it is an incredibly powerful draw source when you have a bunch of 1/1 tokens on the battlefield, so I kind of felt obligated to run it because drawing cards is great. Now, Paradox Haze is a weird one. This is a 3-mana blue enchantment aura that enchants a player, and it says at the beginning of enchanted player's first upkeep each turn, that player gets an additional upkeep after this step. So the idea here is to enchant ourselves, and then we get a second upkeep trigger, which means double the card draw and life gain off Zedruu. It's a little bit cute, it's reliant on our commander, but I've had a lot of success with it, and it's a really fun card, so I love casting it, and I love it in this deck. Next, we have probably the most boring card in the deck. It's Rustic Study. Everybody knows how good this card is. Honestly, I'm probably going to cut it because it is really boring, and I don't like asking people if they want to pay the 1 all the time. Eventually, I'll cut it for sure, I think. So, as I alluded to earlier, this deck has a lot of token producers, and the tokens are there primarily so we can gift them or exchange them for value to steal our opponent's better creatures or just draw cards off Zedruu, or both. So we have a couple cards here that their main purpose is just to make tokens for us to give away to our opponents. And the first one is Kaikar Wind's Fury. This is a Jeskai 4-mana creature, 3/3 with flyer, and it says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying, and you can sacrifice a spirit to add red. So it can sometimes serve as ramp. It also works really well with Ineas because these are flying tokens, so it can help trigger Ineas so we can swap stuff around more easily. And it just provides a lot of easy blockers for us as well, so it's just an all-around really good card, and tokens are invaluable in this deck. And obviously, if we want a good token producer, the first one that comes to mind is usually the Locus God. This is a 6-mana Izzet legendary creature god, a 4/4 with flying, that says whenever you draw a card, you create a 1/1 blue and red insect creature token with flying and haste, and you can pay 4 mana to draw a card and discard a card. And even when it dies, you can just return it back to our hand at the beginning of the next end step. So our deck draws a lot of cards, therefore we're going to make a lot of tokens off the Locus God. This can straight up just win us the game off the back of the Locus God itself, but we can also just use those tokens to exchange stuff or donate stuff or whatever. Simple but effective. And then we've got another token producer, Saheeli Sublime Artificer. This is an Izzet Planeswalker, 3 mana, 5 starting loyalty, And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. So it's a very efficient token generator, and she has a -2 ability. Target artifact you control becomes a copy of another target artifact or creature you control until end of turn, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. So if we have just a big creature on the battlefield or a big artifact, it could even be a mana rock. We could turn a servo into whatever that big creature is or mana rock is, so it has extra value there, but its primary purpose is to churn out a bunch of tokens very mana efficiently for us. So I went over the tokens, and I went over the primary win condition of the deck, which is just basically steal our opponent's better stuff and win the game off that. But there is a backup plan in this deck, and it is a combo that I've actually never pulled off, but is ultra janky and ultra cool, and I am just waiting for the day I can finally actually do this in person because it's going to be so sweet. So this is a 9 lives combo, and it's a 3-card combo, and it starts with the enchantment 9 lives. This is a white enchantment, 1 and double white, for an enchantment with hexproof, and it says if a source would deal damage to you, prevent the damage and put an incarnation counter on 9 lives. When there are 9 or more incarnation counters on 9 lives, you exile it, and when 9 lives leaves the battlefield, you lose the game. So the most important thing here is just the last bit of text, the triggered ability. If it leaves the battlefield, you lose the game. The rest is kind of nonsense because we plan on basically casting 9 lives and then immediately getting rid of it for value. So the idea is we start with 9 lives, we cast it, and then we exile it with Fractured Identity. This is a 5-mana Azorius sorcery that says exile target non-land permanent. Each player other than its controller creates a token that's a copy of it. So what we do is we're going to use Fractured Identity to exile our own 9 lives and give each of our opponents a copy of 9 lives. When that happens, the triggered ability from our 9 lives goes on the stack. It says when it leaves the battlefield, you lose the game. So if that triggered ability resolves, we lose the game. But in response to that triggered ability on the stack, we cast 1 more spell. Patrician Scorn is a white instant that normally costs 4 mana, but if we cast another white spell this turn, we can cast it for free instead, and since we just cast a white spell, we're casting it for free, and it destroys all enchantments. So after we cast Fractured Identity on our own 9 lives, exiling our 9 lives, and giving a copy of 9 lives to each of our opponents, the triggered ability, you lose the game, goes on the stack, and in response to that, we cast Patrician Scorn, which will destroy all enchantments, including the 9 lives copies that we just gave each of our opponents. When that happens, our opponent's 9 lives, you lose the game triggers, go on the stack on top of our own. Those resolve first, they lose the game before we do, and we win the game. So it's a 3-card combo, it's very janky, but I think it's hilarious, it's utterly unique. I've never seen anybody win the game with it, and I hope one day I will get to win the game off it. Alright, now we'll talk about protection in the deck. And one of the best ones is a new card, Guardian of Faith. This is a 3-mana white creature, a 3/2 Spirit Knight with Flash and Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, any number of other target creatures you control phase out, so they just can't be touched, and they'll phase back in on our next turn. This is a great way to just protect our own board of creatures from removal or a board wipe or whatever, just for 3 mana. You just flash it in. And again, it is a creature, so we can just give it away, or we could bounce it and recast it another time. It's a great answer to opposing Cyclonic Rifts, by the way, because if somebody overlords Cyclonic Rift and we were spawned by Guardian of Faith, we phase out all our other creatures so they don't get bounced away, and then Guardian of Faith actually gets bounced back to our hand, and we can do it again another time. Then we've got, obviously, Lightning Greaves, Shroud, Haze, 2 mana, 0 equip. It's just excellent. It's going to protect our most important stuff. Gift of Immortality is a weirder one. It's an aura that can protect our most important creature, because if it dies, you just return the card to the battlefield under its own control, and then you just re-enchant Gift of Immortality onto that creature at end step. So this is a cute way of protecting any of our own important creatures, and then we can just donate it to an opponent, and it doesn't really matter who's controlling it, we still get the same value out of it. And obviously we have Sun Titan in the deck. You gotta have Sun Titan. It's just a really good value engine in any white deck, and there are plenty of targets that it can return to the battlefield from the graveyard. Next up, we got the ramp, and we've got a lot of ramp in this deck. This deck draws a lot of cards, and Zedruu's activated ability is very expensive. It's 3 colored mana, so the deck runs a lot of ramp to make all of that stuff happen. And the first card to talk about is a new inclusion, Bucknard's Everfull Purse. I absolutely love this card. It's a 2-mana artifact. You can pay 1 and tap it, roll a d4, and create a number of treasure tokens equal to the result. The player to your right gains control of Bucknard's Everfull Purse. So we make a couple treasure tokens out of it. It's not really good ramp, but it's another easy way for us to give away a permanent and start drawing cards off Zedruu. Alpine Guide is probably my favorite ramp card in the deck though, because it's kind of mean as well. This is a 3-mana red 3/3 creature that says when it enters a battlefield, you may search your library for a mountain card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. It attacks each combat if able, and when it leaves the battlefield, you sacrifice a mountain. So the idea here is that we're going to ramp out a mountain of Alpine Guide, then immediately donate it so we'll never have to sacrifice a mountain afterwards. But it becomes evil when you give it to somebody who actually has a mountain on the battlefield, because when Alpine Guide leaves the battlefield, they're going to have to sacrifice a mountain. So it's some cheeky land destruction as well. Then we have some of the land deficit cards that I really like. Knight of the White Orchid, 2 white for a 2/2 creature with first strike when it enters the battlefield. If an opponent controls more lands than you, you may search your library for a plains card, put it into the play, then shuffle your library. This deck doesn't have a lot of land ramp on purpose, so I can take advantage of cards like these, and it runs like bounce lands and stuff to go down in lands artificially, so these cards become more reliable. And Knight of the White Orchid caught a new version, Loyal Warhound. It does basically the same thing. It's a 3/1 Vigilance. This time though, it only gets a basic Plains card instead of any Plains card. So it's worse. It doesn't have first strike or anything, but it's still very good. And it is a creature, it's a permanent, so we can exchange or donate it as well afterwards. And the weakest of the land ramping creatures is Core Cartographer, but it's still quite good. It's a 4-mana 2/2, and you get to search your library for any plains card like Knight of the White Orchid and put it into battlefield tapped. You don't have to have less lands than an opponent though, so it's more reliable, but it costs double. And then since it's a commander deck, obviously we have Sol Ring, obviously we have Arcane Signet, Talisman of Creativity, Felwar Stone, and then all the signets in our colors. And then we've got Curse of Opulence, one of my favorite ramp cards in the entire game. It doesn't work with Zedruu because if you give it over to an opponent, they're going to be making the gold tokens, not you. But I still love this card. It's very political. It can redirect attacks to opponents instead of you, so they can get gold, and you'll get gold as well. And if I'm ever in a red deck, I always run Curse of Opulence because I love it to death. And then yes, of course, I'm running Smothering Tithe. Like I said, this deck is incredibly mana hungry. Just donating anything with Zedruu costs 3 colored mana, so you get really, really tight on mana very quickly. So Smothering Tithe is such a godsend for trying to get this deck to function in a timely manner, I would say. So it's very powerful, and I'm happy to have it here. Now, the deck doesn't run a lot of tutor effects because I didn't really want the deck to be consistent in what it's doing. But more importantly, I just don't like shuffling my deck. That's like the worst part of Commander for me. At least Paper Magic is shuffling my deck over and over again. So I intentionally keep as few tutors as possible. And honestly, the tutors that I do have in the deck, I'm seriously considering cutting as well. But the tutor that I will never cut from the deck is Lantax, one of my favorite cards in Commander. This deck consistently has less lands than opponents, and that's by design. So this can consistently find a bunch of basic lands and put them directly into my hand, and it's just insane card advantage for 1 white mana. Weathered Wayfarer is also fantastic in this deck. There are some really powerful utility lands in this deck, one being Homeward Path, which I already talked about, but there are some others as well that it can grab. and it's pretty consistent on finding stuff being at a land deficit. Then we've got Mystical Tutor. It's just very flexible. Sometimes we want to swap all of our creatures for our opponent's better creatures with Cultural Exchange, or sometimes we just want to wipe our opponent's boards with Cyclonic Rift. It can grab anything we really need, though I am seriously considering cutting this card from the deck because it is a little bit too consistent, and again, I don't like shuffling. Expedition Map, another way to find our utility lands. Enlightened Tutor is also going to stay in the deck. It can find any artifact or enchantment, but it finds my favorite card in the deck, which is Illusions of Grandeur. So 9 times out of 10, I'm going to be tutoring up Illusions of Grandeur and draining people for 20. So that's why Tutor is there, basically. And finally, we come to the lands. Most of them are just going to be colored mana fixing for the deck because the deck is so intensive on colored mana. Like Zedruu, again, requires red, white, and blue just to activate, so it's going to be a strain on the deck. So you're not going to see too many colorless lands in the deck unless they're really, really good here. But 3 of my favorite are actually the Karus. All of them, they enter the battlefield, they return a land to our hand, and they tap for 2 colored mana. A lot of people don't like them because they're afraid that your opponents are going to strip mine them or whatever, but I don't think they're really high priority targets for strip mining, even though some people might disagree. They're mostly there to go behind in lands, and they will make our land deficit cards more consistent. So stuff like Knight of the White Orchid, inland tax, and whatnot. That's their primary purpose here, and they do really, really well at that job, I think. And then obviously we have Command Tower, a random foil Exotic Orchard. I generally don't have foils in this deck, but this one was the only copy I had, so. And then we have the Checklands, Clifftop Retreat, Glacial Fortress, and Sulphur Falls. We also have the Battle Bond Duels, Sea of Clouds, Training Center, and Spectator Seating. We have the Shocklands in our colors, Steam Fence, Hallowed Fountain, and Sacred Foundry. We got the Cycling Duel, Irrigated Farmland, Prairie Stream, and we have 1 fetch land, Flooded Strand. Honestly, I don't know why it's in the deck. I really don't like shuffling. I thought I got rid of all the fetch lands, but this will be one that I need to cut. And like I said, this deck draws a lot of cards, so I'm willing to run a colorless Reliquary Tower to make sure I don't have to discard to hand size all the time. And Karakeep might be colorless, but paying 3 mana essentially to make a creature token is invaluable in the deck. It's a 0/1, so you can Skull Clamp it or whatever, but you can also just use it to exchange control for your opponent's creatures, which is also really nice. Then we also have Rogren Triumph, really good. Strip Mine to get rid of problematic utility lands and also go down in lands in the process. And finally, we have the basic lands. I run a bunch because, we have land tax effects, and also it's a 3-color deck and you can kind of get away with running a decent amount of basics in it. And also, more importantly, is the fact that I really like the lands on these basic lands. I picked my favorite ones, so I didn't really want to cut down and remove some of my favorite artworks in the deck. So the island here is Urza's Saga. This one's also one of my favorite island artworks. It's from Mirage, another beauty from Saga. And you know what? You can just look at the artwork yourself while I'm going through them. And there we go. That is a tour of my first ever commander deck that I still play a decade later, Zedruu the Greathearted. It's a very unique deck, I would say. It runs a ton of cards that you won't really see outside of a Zedruu deck, which is really exciting to me. It's what brings me joy in Magic. It runs a lot of pet cards that I really like, and even the basic lands. I spent a lot of great care to choose artwork that I feel fits the deck, what the deck wants to evoke aesthetically, and what's meaningful to me, I think. This deck not only is a deck that I find very fun mechanically, and I think my opponents generally enjoy, minus maybe like Pyromancer Swath or whatever, but it's also a deck that has a lot of sentimental value to me. It was the first deck that I ever played in terms of Commander. It's what brought me into the format that I love so much and basically made a career out of now. And it also reminds me of my friends who joined with me into Commander, who we went into the game together and we shared a lot of beautiful memories together. And so whenever time I pick up this deck and pick up Zedruu, which I've now, this card I've owned for over a decade now, it brings up all those fond memories of all those games long past and all the games that I continue to have with it. So yeah, it's a deck that I have close to my heart. And for people who have reached the end of this video here, thank you for letting me share my passion and share one of my favorite decks and the history behind it. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you liked this little setup here. If you did enjoy this deck tour and you want to see more deck tours of a similar fashion, make sure to like and subscribe and maybe leave a comment. Let me know what you'd like to see in a future video, how you would like me to change it up. Do you want shorter explanations perhaps, because I basically read out every single card and explained its value? Did I drone on a little bit too much? Do you want something longer? Maybe you want a longer video. I don't know. Probably not though. But anyway, just let me know in the comment section what do you like in the future ones. And if you did like it, like and subscribe. And thank you so much for watching. And until next time, friends. See ya.